Think you're all caught up on facts about the Beatles? Think again. From a classic song inspired by a breakfast dish to an impromptu acid trip with a wicked dentist, this is everything you didn't know about the legendary rock group. Which version of the Beatles do you like better? The clean-cut, suit-clad pop idols of the early to mid-60s? Or is your preference the colorful, bearded hippies who revolutionized all forms of rock? Here's a third option. The early Beatles were basically punks. Before Brian Epstein discovered them, the Beatles played in dingy nightclubs, clad in leather jackets and jeans, and were prone to smoking and swearing on stage. The band would even eat chicken between songs. For a while, it seemed like the group was destined to play tiny clubs forever. Then Epstein came along. He felt the group had potential but needed to be cleaned up.
We didn't want to appear as a gang of idiots, and Brian suggested that we just sort of wore ordinary suits.
Epstein had them ditch the leather and denim for freshly tailored suits, styled their hairdos into something more fashionable, and even had them string their guitars correctly. Back then, the Beatles had excess guitar wire dangling from the tuning knobs, which looked messy and unprofessional. Epstein got them to stop doing that. The band wasn't thrilled with Epstein's ideas initially, but soon realized how helpful they could be. According to the Beatles anthology, John Lennon said this about the band's decision to implement Epstein's changes. It was a choice of making it or still eating chicken on stage. It's well known that the Beatles smoked marijuana regularly. By the time they were into the more experimental phase of the recording career, one could practically catch a contact high from their music. They didn't start out that way, however. In fact, their initiation can be traced back to one night and one man. The night in question was August 28, 1964. According to Peter Brown and Stephen Gaines's The Love You Make, an insider story of the Beatles, that's when Bob Dylan showed up in the Fab Four's hotel room and introduced them to the drug. The Beatles' manager Brian Epstein reluctantly admitted that none of them had ever really smoked weed before, which left Dylan a bit puzzled. According to Brown and Gaines's book, Dylan asked the band, "But what about your song, the one about getting high?" He was referring, of course, to I Want to Hold Your Hand. This prompted John Lennon to tell Dylan that the lyric he had in mind was not actually I get high, but rather I can't hide. From there, Dylan suggested that some grass was in order. On Dylan's insistence, the band smoked marijuana for the very first time, and by the end of the night, everyone was in stitches. Paul McCartney even insisted that the band's road manager Mal Evans follow him around with a pad and pencil to write down everything he said. Unfortunately, Evans' notes have since been lost, so we'll never know what deep thoughts McCartney might have had. Nearly every Beatles song not written by George Harrison or Ringo Starr gets credited to Lennon-McCartney. That's due to an early agreement between the two musicians and Brian Epstein, the band's manager. Epstein and Lennon proposed that any song Lennon or McCartney wrote would be credited to Lennon-McCartney.
I would say to people that out of, I think it's about 300 songs that John and I wrote together, we never had a dry session.
According to McCartney in a 2015 Esquire interview, he was initially fine with that, but suggested the credit be reversed if he were the primary writer. Epstein and Lennon supposedly agreed, but it never happened. Ultimately, any song they wrote, including songs with one writer, got the same Lennon-McCartney credit. Sometimes McCartney seems fine with the arrangement, as he told Esquire, "It's a good logo, like Rodgers and Hammerstein. Hammerstein and Rodgers doesn't work." Other times he's irked by being the second guy in the name, particularly on songs like Yesterday, which McCartney wrote entirely by himself. Furthermore, in the digital era, McCartney's name often gets cut from public view. He explained to Esquire, "What starts to happen is a song by John Lennon and, you know how on your iPad there's never enough room? So it's kind of important who comes first." McCartney also told Esquire he tried to get his alternating credits idea going after the band broke up. Yoko allegedly said yes, but then backtracked for unexplained reasons. Decades later, we're not likely to see McCartney-Lennon on anything official anytime soon. During a 1964 tour of the United States, the Beatles showed up to play the Gator Bowl in Jacksonville, Florida, and were greeted with an unwelcome circumstance. The show that night was supposed to be segregated, meaning black concertgoers on one side of the arena and white attendees on the other. Needless to say, having a segregated audience simply did not fly with the band. According to the BBC, John Lennon proclaimed, "We never played to segregated audiences, and we aren't going to start now. I'd sooner lose our appearance money."
We don't like it if there's any segregation or anything because it just seems mad to me.
As it turned out, the Beatles did play that night, but only after the audience was allowed to freely mingle. The experience apparently prompted them to rework their live performance contracts to specifically state that they would not play for segregated crowds. In a 2018 interview with GQ, McCartney described how years later, the civil rights movement in America inspired him to write one of the band's most iconic songs. He told the outlet, "Blackbird, I was sitting around with my acoustic guitar and I'd heard about the civil rights troubles that were happening in the 60s in Alabama, Mississippi, Little Rock in particular. It's hopefully a good message." One of the most beloved Beatles songs of all time, Yesterday is a simple yet poignant lament for lost love and memories of a better time. but it started life with perhaps the goofiest lyrics the band ever penned. According to Paul McCartney, the song's melody first appeared to him in a dream. He woke up, hit the right chords on a nearby piano, and had the building blocks for an all-time classic. But to ensure he didn't forget the song when he was fully awake, McCartney wrote some placeholder lyrics, calling the song Scrambled Eggs. McCartney wrote the following Dylan-esque couplet: "Scrambled eggs, oh my baby, how I love your legs." McCartney didn't write any egg-related words after that because he caught the giggles and couldn't continue. That said, Scrambled Eggs soon became Yesterday, and the rest is music history. But decades later, McCartney finally got around to finishing his first draft poem. In 2013, he appeared on Late Night with Jimmy Fallon, and the two sang a duet of the completed version of Scrambled Eggs. The Beatles are closely associated with LSD, but it wasn't a fellow rock star who introduced the drug to the band. In fact, the first time the band did LSD, it was because of a dentist. As the band recounted in the Beatles anthology, in 1965, John Lennon, George Harrison, and both of their girlfriends were having dinner with a friend that Harrison called a wicked dentist. Without their knowledge or consent, the dentist slipped LSD into their coffee. Harrison felt the dentist had sexual adventures in mind and wanted them all in the right good mood for an orgy. But they had places to go and skipped out. Later, they started feeling the drug's effects. As Harrison recalled in the Beatles anthology, it was something like a very concentrated version of the best feeling I'd ever had in my whole life. It was fantastic. I felt in love, not with anything or anybody in particular, but with everything. Everything was perfect in a perfect light. Later, on the drive home, Lennon recalled freaking out over a red light he thought was a fire, while Harrison remembered concentrating on driving only 18 miles per hour. Once home, Lennon decided that Harrison's home was a submarine and he was piloting it. No word on whether the submarine was yellow, but probably. The ever-popular Get Back is mostly a fun song about hippies and the counterculture, but during the writing phase, the song was about something very different. It was a scathing satire of xenophobia. Informally dubbed No Pakistanis by fans, the original lyrics for Get Back featured lines like this: "Who is that black man? Don't dig no Pakistanis taking all the people's jobs." According to Salon, the song was meant to satirize anti-immigration sentiments. Taken at face value, it does seem like a sincere anti-immigrant song, so it's probably best that the group never completed or released this version. In a 1986 interview with Rolling Stone, McCartney made it clear that the song was a satire. He told the outlet, "If there was any group that was not racist, it was the Beatles. I mean, all our favorite people were always black." During the Beatles' later years, John Lennon was extremely fond of opaque lyrics that were open to all manner of interpretation. Other than I Am the Walrus, there is probably no better example of this than Happiness is a Warm Gun from 1968's The Beatles, also known as the White Album. Apparently, many fans have assumed the song to be about drugs, particularly heroin. However, Lennon said that the tune's inspiration was much more straightforward. It came from a magazine for gun enthusiasts. According to A Hard Day's Right, the stories behind every Beatles song, producer George Martin had brought the magazine to the studio during the recording of the White Album. On the cover of the magazine was the phrase, "Happiness is a warm gun in your hand." According to the book, Lennon remarked, "I thought, what a fantastic thing to say. A warm gun means you just shot something." In 1968, the Beatles took an odd and highly publicized vacation to Rishikesh, India, to study transcendental meditation under Maharishi Mahesh Yogi.
I was really impressed with the Maharishi, and I was impressed because he was laughing all the time.
The band members stayed for varying lengths of time. Ringo Starr left after a week and a half, Paul McCartney took off not long after, and John Lennon and George Harrison stuck it out for about 2 months. But while staying in India, all the Beatles were struck by inspiration, penning tunes that would appear on the White Album and Abbey Road. Some of the songs written during their India trip included Revolution, Rocky Raccoon, Blackbird, Back in the USSR, and Dear Prudence, which was inspired by Mia Farrow's sister, who was also present at the retreat. Even Ringo got into the act, writing the country-flavored Don't Pass Me By. The song was Ringo's first solo composition to make its way onto a Beatles album. It's not hyperbole to say that the Beatles are among the most influential musicians of the 20th century. Their songwriting, lyricism, and musicianship has been the subject of endless critical analysis and has been emulated by countless artists. So it's kind of surprising that none of them could read or write music. This was disclosed by John Lennon in his 1980 interview with Playboy when he was asked to give his opinion about Ringo Starr's musicianship. Lennon praised the musical contributions of Starr, calling him a damn good drummer, before adding that none of the band members were technical geniuses on their instruments. Lennon told the outlet, "None of us are technical musicians, none of us could read music, none of us can write it. But as pure musicians, as inspired humans to make the noise, Paul and Ringo are as good as anybody." The Beatles famously stopped touring at the height of their popularity in 1966, thus allowing them to focus solely on writing and recording. There was, however, still a demand for them to appear on television to promote those recordings, something no one in the band wanted to do. Speaking with the New York Times in 2015, Ringo Starr described the solution to this problem. He told the newspaper, "We did come to the solid thought, well, we can't be everywhere, so we made these little movies and sent them out." These little movies were then known as promotional films, but today they would be recognized as music videos, an art form that the Beatles helped pioneer. Many of their early clips, such as the shorts for Help and I Feel Fine, were exceedingly simple. Later, though, the Beatles' promo films would come to match the artistry of their music. In particular, the clips for Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever were wildly innovative for their time. After a frenetic editing period of just under 2 weeks, both clips were shown on the iconic British program Top of the Pops on February 15, 1967. Hence, the Beatles showcased the music video form well over a decade before MTV launched it into the popular consciousness.
I want my MTV!
The Fab Four may generally be considered a self-contained unit, but this was not necessarily the case. Sure, they occasionally employed studio musicians, but there were a couple of individuals who made such huge contributions to the band that they might have been considered an actual member. First and foremost was producer George Martin. As a Beatles producer, Martin's contributions went beyond indulging the band's more unconventional ideas through wild studio experimentation. Martin actually played piano and organ on a number of recordings, arranged the orchestral elements of tunes such as Yesterday, and arranged vocal harmonies on songs like Here, There, and Everywhere. Any discussion about a so-called fifth Beatle, though, wouldn't be complete without mentioning American singer, songwriter, and keyboardist Billy Preston, who played an integral role in the recording of the Beatles' final released album, Let It Be. Preston had been an acquaintance of the band since their Hamburg days and was invited to sit in during the album's recording by George Harrison. According to the CBC, Preston was described by his former manager Joyce Moore as the glue and glitter that held the band together during this period. For his contribution, Billy Preston became the only outside musician to ever receive credit on the liner notes of a Beatles album.
You're in the groove.
When Eleanor Rigby appeared on the Beatles' 1966 album Revolver, a heartbreaking tune marked the band's starkest departure yet from their usual repertoire of poppy love songs. The tale of a lonely old woman who dies alone and is buried along with her name is probably among the saddest pieces of popular music ever written. It is also a very curious outlier among the band's discography, in that not a single Beatle actually played an instrument on it. For the track, producer George Martin enlisted 2 quartets of string musicians and took the lead in arranging the parts they would play. And it's no accident that the foreboding, eerie instrumentation is slightly reminiscent of the great composer Bernard Herrmann either. Martin has said that he was influenced by Herrmann's score for the 1966 film adaptation of Ray Bradbury's science fiction novel Fahrenheit 451. George Harrison and John Lennon sang backup on the tune, thus complementing Paul McCartney's mournful lead vocal. Meanwhile, Ringo Starr sat the recording out completely. Perhaps to make up for this, Eleanor Rigby was released as a double A-side single, backed by a song with a star lead vocal, Yellow Submarine. The group would make a few more songs in the coming years that saw them only contribute vocals, including Good Night, She's Leaving Home, and The Inner Light. Eleanor Rigby and the other songs weren't the only tunes missing any instrumental contribution from a member of the Beatles. John Lennon was known to sit out songs on a fairly regular basis, and Paul McCartney played drums on a few tunes in Ringo Starr's absence, including Back in the USSR and the Ballad of John and Yoko. But in the band's entire catalog, there was only one solitary tune that McCartney refused to play on, She Said from the Revolver album. According to the Paul McCartney biography, many years from now, the song has its origins in a 1965 house party. Also present at the party was actor Peter Fonda, who was attempting to comfort an LSD-tripping George Harrison. When Harrison remarked that he felt like he was dying, Fonda told him not to worry, saying, "I know what it's like to be dead." The remark annoyed John Lennon, but it evidently stuck with him as he eventually used it as a key lyric in She Said. The relationship between Paul McCartney and John Lennon was famously contentious, but as it turns out, the two did have a brief reunion of sorts after the Beatles broke up.
I haven't worked with Paul because we had a more difficult time, but now we're pretty close.
This happened during Lennon's infamous Lost Weekend, during which he just sort of hung out in New York City and LA with his assistant May Pang for about a year and a half. He spent much of this time drinking, doing drugs, carousing with Harry Nilsson, and occasionally recording some music. One night in 1974, Lennon happened to run into his old bandmate at a studio in Burbank. Nilsson was also there that night, as well as a guy named Stevie Wonder. The resulting session should have been unbelievably epic. However, they ended up being the exact opposite of that, perhaps as a result of all the cocaine that was flying around the studio. The chaotic, messy, and downright boring bootleg recording has come to be known as a toot and a snore in 74, a reference to the coke being used and the boredom in the studio.
The Beatles' lyrics were unlike most other pop music of the time, but that doesn't mean they were intentionally writing profound poetry. Case in point, I Am the Walrus, perhaps the most lyrically obtuse Beatles song of them all. As it turns out, it's almost completely gibberish, put out by John Lennon as a poke at people taking his pop music too seriously. Lennon was working on the song when he received a letter from a student at his old school, Quarry Bank. The student told Lennon that his teacher was having them read Beatles lyrics and analyze them for deeper meaning. Lennon was deeply amused by the idea, so to mess with this teacher, he decided to take the absurdity of I Am the Walrus completely over the top. He recalled a playground chant from his childhood and then warped that into completely meaningless lyrics, like yellow matter custard dripping from a dead dog's eye. Ever since the Beatles broke up, people have laid the blame on Lennon's widow, Yoko Ono. According to this story, everything was fine in the band. Then Yoko showed up, convinced John he was better than his bandmates, and the two went off to record weird music together. Except it's just not true. The Beatles were almost certainly going to break up anyway, and anyone who blames Yoko is simply angry at the wrong target. Paul McCartney himself has argued as much.
But she certainly didn't break the group up. The group was breaking up.
In McCartney's mind, Lennon was ready to leave anyway, having grown tired of the unhealthy rivalry between the band members. As far as McCartney's concerned, all Ono did was provide Lennon with the courage and inspiration to leave, and to embrace his own creativity full throttle. Approximately 1 second after the Beatles broke up, the public began clamoring for a reunion. Amazingly, we almost got just that on April 24, 1976, and it would have taken place on the first season of Saturday Night Live. During the evening's episode, SNL producer Lorne Michaels appeared on camera to offer the Beatles a comically low $3,000 to reunite on his show and sing a paltry 3 songs.
We've heard from the Monkees, Freddie and the Dreamers, Herman's Hermits, Peter and Gordon, the Cowsills, and Lulu. But still, no word from the Beatles.
Obviously, Michaels had no reason to believe the group would actually take him up on the offer, but it actually almost happened. As it turns out, John and Paul were in New York City, hanging out and watching the show together. As Lennon recounted in the book All We Are Saying, the pair actually considered taking a cab down to the studio and accepting Michaels' offer, just to be funny. Ultimately, they chose not to, but not because the money wasn't right or because they were worried it would be detrimental to their legacy, but because they were just too tired. However, later that year, George Harrison appeared on the show and attempted to take Michaels up on the offer. The Yesterday and Today album cover is safe and pedestrian, with the band posing around an empty suitcase. But when the album first hit shelves in June 1966, it was to feature an entirely different, far more controversial image: the Fab Four posing with dead babies. The babies were actually just doll parts, but it's still a little shocking that the lads tried to pull off the stunt. The idea came from one of the band's favorite photographers, Robert Whittaker. He was fed up with taking squeaky clean pictures of the Beatles and decided to revolutionize what pop idols are. Most of the Beatles were down for it, with McCartney claiming that it was their comment on the Vietnam War. But ultimately, a wide release of the cover didn't happen, for the same reason behind most things in life: money. The Beatles were negotiating a new record deal and didn't want to alienate any potential suitors, so they okayed the new, inoffensive cover. In March 1966, John Lennon sparked more controversy than he ever intended to. During an interview with the London Evening Standard, he claimed, "Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity." Few in England were bothered by the comments, but then it was republished in the American magazine Datebook, which led to outrage, prompting Lennon to clarify his comments.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time. I wasn't knocking it or putting it down, I was just saying it.
Radio stations called for Beatles boycotts. There were public record smashings, concerts were picketed, the Vatican condemned the band, and they even started receiving death threats. Eventually, after a cherry bomb went off during a concert and spooked the band into thinking someone shot at them, they quit touring completely. This story has an even more unfortunate coda. One of the people outraged by Lennon's quote was a born-again Christian named Mark David Chapman, once one of Lennon's biggest fans. Chapman admitted that the Jesus comment sent him into a spiral of hatred, which eventually culminated with him assassinating Lennon. While Lennon's life ended very tragically, we can take solace in the fact that the music he and his bandmates created continues to inspire the world.